Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Fringe Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you?
How's it, Nick? How's it going?
It was very low energy, Marius. I'm disappointed.
How's it, Nick? How's it going? How's it, everybody?
There we go. And we also have Mr. Chris Hattingh today. Chris, how are you doing?
Hi, Nick and Marius. Yeah, just Googling how to prepare for a nuclear winter here on the southern tip of Africa. So let's make sure we get those that advice rolling in the show.
Indeed. And we'll talk about that in a second. So yesterday, people asked me if Gabriel Krauser would be on the show to talk about the extension of the state of disaster. He is not, because unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on your point of view, he is currently fighting the good fight on Power FM. And we we wish him well with that, because that's much less fun than the Daily Friend Show, but it's work that needs to be done. So we'll try to cover that topic today. Chris is also on the campaigns team, so I'm sure he'll be able to give us some insight into that. But anyway, let us get onto our first story today, and that is news from Tuesday coming out of Eskom to do with their nuclear power plant, Koeberg. Eskom lost nearly 920 megawatts of power to the grid when an individual at the nuclear power station at Koeberg cut the wrong valve. This was reported in Eskom's newsletter to its employees, which amusingly is called Shutdown Times, which is just perfect. While carrying out, this is what the newsletter said, while carrying out required maintenance on Unit 2, someone cut the valve of Unit 1 instead of the same valve on Unit 2, the newsletter read. This significant error could have had, quote, devastating consequences. Eskom had to implement a work stoppage following the incident, which could have resulted in the loss of a running unit. However, they say that their high safety measures were able to identify the error in time to prevent any damage from being caused. The newsletter itself, so this is Eskom speaking, said, "This speaks to very poor human performance and is an unacceptable practice." Practice spelled wrong, I think. So anyway, yeah, look, I mean, I think we mustn't get too freaked out about this kind of thing. As anyone, I'm not a nuclear engineer or physicist or anything by any stretch of the imagination, but I've followed the story of Chernobyl, which is, of course, the world's worst nuclear disaster, quite closely. And it's actually spectacular how much had to go wrong and how much of it was really just simply due to Soviet communist system and design flaws and stuff in that reactor. So, we're not going to have Chernobyl with South Africa, even in the worst case scenario. Still, I must say that learning about possibly losing one of our most longest running stable power plants, and also one that happens to be nuclear quite close to Cape Town, doesn't make me the happiest chappy in the world. Chris, what do you make of this? This kind of seems like it's a bit emblematic of all the problems at Eskom, doesn't it?
I think you're exactly right, and I also don't, unfortunately, consider myself an expert on nuclear. I might be an expert on foreign policy and climate change and philosophy and all the rest of it, as the winds change on Twitter, but not on nuclear. But I think yeah, exactly. As long as there's some measure of fail-safe with every single component, hopefully you hope that the fail-safes also work. There was a story earlier this year with Koeberg as well, wasn't it, with an issue with some of their storage. So you start to see a bit of a pattern, maybe, with not the requisite level of expertise and maintenance being done, and that can snowball and then eventually have a devastating consequence. So maybe it's simply emblematic of the general decline in Eskom and the periphery bodies associated with it.
Definitely. So Unit 2, which is the part of the reactor that was supposed to be shut off or have the valve closed on it, is actually offline at the moment for maintenance and refueling, because presumably the fuel rods need to be replaced. But I mean, it seems like an incredibly rookie error to turn off the wrong valve. It's like you forget which one you're servicing here. I mean, it's the kind of mistake that I think even a layperson, if they were paying attention, wouldn't make. The reason that they were fiddling with the valves is apparently that Eskom was actually replacing some of the steam generators on Unit 2, and this is why they need to close the steam valves. Marius, what do you make of all this?
I don't think there's going to be Chernobyl Fontaine down in the Cape. I'm pretty sure that both the two biggest nuclear disasters in history, Chernobyl and Fukushima, Chernobyl was because of poor design and lots of human error and lots of lies.
Right, like they didn't even
communists.
The reactor itself, I don't think, even had a proper containment structure over it. So when it blew up, instead of being caught in a big concrete structure, just shot out the roof, which thankfully is not going to happen at Koeberg, even if they did absolutely the stupidest thing possible.
And Fukushima was obviously because of a huge earthquake and following tsunami and so on. But I think what is concerning, I think this is what's concerning people who follow this kind of thing, is that Koeberg is apparently the biggest single generation unit in Africa. It supplies 920 megawatts to the grid. And if that's out of action permanently, then I think that's going to have some serious results in some serious problems for South Africa's energy supply and electricity grid. And I think that's really the problem. But what's also is quite concerning is that this seems to be simply human error. I can't remember if it was at Kusile or Medupi. There was that boiler that exploded and puts also lost however many megawatts to the grid. And that was also apparently simply human error. There was no other reason. It wasn't because of a thing just breaking down from wear and tear, whatever it is. Just somebody did something wrong. They weren't paying attention or didn't read their instructions properly, whatever the case is. And that happened. And seems like this is exactly what happened at Koeberg now. So that's worrying, and who knows what the issues are. I see Diane McKeekan says, what about 3 Mile Island? I think there's, when she's talking about nuclear accidents, as far as I know, with nuclear accidents, they're on a scale of from 1 to 5. And there have only been 2 scale 5 accidents ever, which were Chernobyl and Fukushima. I believe 3 Mile Island was a 3 or 4. I'm not too sure, but it wasn't on a scale 5, so it wasn't quite the same. And I'm not sure actually.
Yeah. Also, I don't think a single person died from 3 Mile Island. I may speak under correction, but I think it's literally no one.
Yeah, and they haven't had to put an exclusion zone around 3 Mile Island, which they've obviously had to do around Chernobyl and the Fukushima power plants and so on. So yeah, it's this is obviously a bit worrying. It tells you something about what's happening at ESCOM, that there's obviously people are doing jobs that they shouldn't be doing, or there's lack of oversight or something. But it's definitely something that we need to keep an eye on, and it's definitely worrying for South Africa's future energy supply issues.
Yeah, I think it also speaks to this deeper problem, and I think Andre de Reis has even talked about it. It's a kind of culture of sort of sloppiness, and I think a lot of this speaks to a big problem in a lot of South African institutions, which is the weakness of middle management. This is my personal experience, and I think you can see it definitely all across government, but even in some parts of the private sector, that in a lot of places, middle management doesn't really kind of hold people to account or properly manage employees, or manages by shouting or something like that. And so you get a kind of situation where people are just a bit sloppy. They don't really care what they're doing. They're not really focused on what they're doing. And, we get boilers blowing up or the wrong valve being closed, which, I may be speaking from ignorance here, but it doesn't seem like it's a kind of mistake that you should make, especially if you know what you're doing. And I suspect that's down to sloppiness. Chris, any thoughts on that point before we move on?
No, I only support what you're saying, because I couldn't agree with you more. We shouldn't think it's the public sector, public sector that would only have these issues. It's maybe indicative of what's happening across the country.
Indeed.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick point. There's a book called When Smuts Goes. It was written in 1946 or 47, I think, by a South African historian called Arthur Keppel-Jones, and it was a future history of South Africa from basically 1950 when 1950 up until 2015. He predicted what was going to happen in South Africa, and I won't go into it. But anyway, Jan Smuts loses the election. He predicts the National Party comes to power and so on, and there's a rebellion in South Africa. The white government gets overthrown. Black government takes over and so on. And the end of the book is set in 2015, and now he's speaking about somebody who's visiting South Africa. And one of the things that the person observes is that there's nobody cares about anything. Everything's always breaking down. He says an anecdote of when he goes into a hotel and he tells the person that the roof's leaking in the room, and then nothing's done to fix the roof. They simply bring in a bucket to catch the leaking, and I think that is kind of indicative of what's is happening in South Africa. The core problems aren't getting fixed, and they just kind of band-aids put over what are the problems. And until we get to the core issues, we're going to carry on with a lot of the problems we have in this country.
Definitely. All right, let's move on to our next story for today. And of course, we have seen that the state of disaster has been extended again. And this is after it was basically the health department said, yeah, no, this is the last time we're going to, we don't really need this anymore. There's data coming out now that shows that there's no sort of statistical reason why COVID should be, whether that COVID is actually a big problem anymore. But government keeps saying something along the lines of, look, we have to keep extending the thing until we can make the regulations around COVID permanent. Right. There's, of course, been a lot of pushback to this, not just from the IRR, but I believe the DA actually said something today. Chris, talk us through what's going on with the state of disaster here. Why has it been extended again, and what are people doing about it?
I guess at this point we should say that South Africa does have a permanent state of disaster, and that is the current ruling party. And as long as that's the case, we aren't going to see the sort of growth that the country needs. But that's beside the point, something we can get into at another time. So last month, President Ramaphosa promised to withdraw the regulations around the state of disaster, and he reiterated calls by medical experts for this to be done. But despite all of that, COGTA Minister Dlamini Zuma extended the ruling till April 15th. This effectively means 2 years of rule by arbitrary and irrational decree will continue. So a lot of the justification, if one is trying to be neutral with the language, I guess, from government side, is that they haven't had enough time to establish the amendments to existing legislation and regulations that they need to manage the affairs of the country in the case that we had another wave, for example, of COVID cases or another pandemic or something like that. But of course, the state of disaster, the act itself allows for a state of disaster to be enacted when a disaster warrants it. So they could impose that again if it really became such an emergency sort of situation. You have the same kind of idea with a state of emergency. So that's a pretty flimsy excuse. When we look at some of the arbitrariness of the regulations, I mean, sports stadiums will remain closed to fans, curfews may be instituted overnight, alcohol sales could be banned again. And this also just shows that despite saying that they listen to medical experts and take them on board, the government simply can't think of anything besides imposing this sort of rule by arbitrary decree. So there's no imagination, no actual hard work being done regarding implementing public health measures outside the state of disaster framework, if indeed combating COVID is the aim of this extension. So then we can get into, is that really the aim, or is this just another attempt by government to extend its emergency powers because they simply don't want to let go of that power? Maybe we'll see another ban on tobacco, the sale of tobacco, for example, to feed certain pockets and make more profits for some people connected with the innermost of government. And this, of course, comes from the National Coronavirus Command Council, which is, I guess, another outflow of these regulations. So it shows that this body, which is unaccountable to Parliament, will continue to exist. One wonders for how long. Of course, the RR has a campaign against the NCCC, calling for the disbandment thereof. In a proper constitutional democracy, there shouldn't be room for these shadow bodies, even if they're quote-unquote part of government or not. They should all be accountable to Parliament at the very least, and their minutes should be published, as well as the reasons for the decisions that they've made. This latest extension was done without consultation, and I think we're seeing across the board a wide-scale civil society reaction to this. So hopefully court cases and the like coming down the line.
Exactly. I believe John Steenhuisen just a short time ago said the DA would be taken to court. I know the IRR has already had our lawyers, I think, in communication with the presidency and the command council over this. Chris, correct me if I'm wrong about that. Marius, you were remarking this morning about how stupid and arbitrary some of these things are. Chris already mentioned the stadiums thing, but there were other stuff that annoyed you.
Oh, well, it's, you can't go watch a cricket match or rugby match or soccer match with more than 2,000 people. And this is a big open air stadium with capacity for 30 or 40,000 people, but only 2,000 people are allowed. But you can go to a pub or mall that is completely packed and you can walk around there and you just need to wear a mask. And, that doesn't really make any sense to me. As also, it's all so performative. I'm sure for most of our listeners, you'll notice like you walk to the front door of a restaurant or pub, you put on your mask, you walk then 2 or 3 meters to your table, and you remove your mask and you sit down. While your poor waiter, who is on their feet all day, walking up and down and actually exerting themselves, has to wear a mask, while you don't have to. I think it's also the government is trying to show it's doing something, because the government's already shown now for a while it's not capable of actually, doing anything that's difficult. It's much easier just to make these ridiculous arbitrary rules. Another one that came out, that social distancing is still in place, but it's being reduced to 1 meter instead of 1.5 meters. It's completely ridiculous.
So we're supposed to be walking around with a measuring tape and so
exactly.
Everyone a little bit closer.
Exactly. It's such a joke. And we've seen now Namibia has removed their mask mandate. I saw Kenya is also planning on doing it. Most of Europe has. I think the US has. So most countries are moving past this thing now. And, it's open question whether the normal cloth masks that most people wear actually do anything. If it's anything more than just a security blanket. I'm not too sure if it is. And also, I think now there's the fundamental difference between free society and unfree society. In a free society, everything is allowed except that which is forbidden. In an unfree society, nothing is allowed except that which is expressly allowed. And I think if we're not careful, I don't think we're heading headlong into some kind of totalitarian dictatorship. But I do think there's some big warning signs, and I think this is one of those where, a government can, at the stroke of a pen, the Cyril Ramaphosa could come on TV tonight and say, by the way, alcohol is banned again, without any, discussion. And we can talk about the social problems alcohol causes, but there's the wider issues of, the damage it does to the economy, to people's livelihoods, and all kinds of things. Tomorrow the president could say, nobody's allowed to be in a taxi anymore because it spreads COVID, and what kind of the implications of that. So the government can, just do these things at a stroke of a pen. And Chris is exactly right. We can't be in a constitutional democracy with these kind of shadow bodies who, basically who telling people how to live their lives, and they shouldn't be able to do it. Let's be honest here. COVID's basically done. 80% or more of South Africans are now immune to it through either prior infection or being vaccinated. And we know, I also was reading a thing recently, Omicron now, this is a statistic from England, but I would imagine it's, holds for the rest of the world too. Omicron now is less dangerous than ordinary flu. So sure, the different other COVID variants were more dangerous than ordinary flu, especially for older people. But now even for people who are 80 years and older, Omicron is you're better off getting Omicron than the normal flu that goes around every year. So we really need to move away from this, and it just shows you this government it's completely out of ideas because it's still doing this. The fact that we still have a state of disaster simply so that the government can draw up new rules to, combat this pandemic, which is basically over. It just shows you that they've run out of ideas and, energy. And, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I think we might be in the last 2 years of ANC government.
Right. It's funny because there are a couple of places around the world, a couple of governments that are continuing to sort of follow these regulations that aren't entirely necessary. And I saw some Americans talking about this recently, how getting on a plane from London to go to New York, you need to wear a mask through the whole flight. You need a PCR test to prove that you don't have COVID when you go on. But if you get on a plane in New York to fly to London, you don't need a test or need to wear a mask. So
I saw a thing. It was actually a Trevor Noah clip. So the vaccine mandate now is in New York is you don't need to be vaccinated to go watch a sports game, but you need to be vaccinated to go to work. So there was a basketball player. I don't know what his name is. I don't follow the sport, but he's refused to get vaccinated, so he couldn't play in a certain
basketball.
game. Yeah, basketball.
It's
and
probably Kyrie Irving, I think.
He couldn't play in a certain game, but he could go buy a ticket and go watch the same game his teammates were playing, so he could be in the stadium, be with everybody, not wearing a mask, not be vaccinated, but if you wanted to play the game, you had to be vaccinated. It shows you how.
Yeah, he even went up onto the court and hugged his teammates. And
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Anyway, okay. So yeah, obviously, we thought that once the health department had kind of come onto our side of the fence, and with pretty much most of the medical experts in the country behind getting rid of at least most of these regulations, that this would be a done deal. But apparently government's going to be really stubborn about this, and so RR plus all other good pieces of civil society, I'm sure, will be fighting back against the continuing extension of this ridiculous state of disaster. And I would just like to remind everyone, even those who are still worried about COVID or something like that, you can always put a state of disaster back once you've cancelled it, right? It's not like it has to be a permanent thing. Okay, let's move on to our next topic. The Federal Reserve in the United States is, of course, a very important financial institution because it sets, in many ways, the tempo of a lot of the world's economy. Now, the Federal Reserve looks like it's going to be increasing its interest rates for the first time since 2018. And it looks like some of these the planned interest rate increases might be some of the most steep ones we've seen in a very long time. So, Chris, can you just explain to us very briefly, what does this actually mean? What does it mean to increase interest rates? Why should we care about what the American Federal Reserve is doing? Talk us through this, and what is the consequences for South Africa?
Yeah, so just a bit of a context point. This, of course, follows now from a couple of years of increased spending by governments, especially the US, in terms of stimulus, sending checks to citizens as they impose lockdowns, trying to keep economic activity going in that way. So, of course, taking on a lot more debt, a lot more borrowing, and eventually that has to be paid off in some way. Depends on whether you own the debt or not. But that's just the meta sort of context with it. So basically, when interest rates increase, people end up paying high rates on things like mortgages and credit cards, and businesses also see some of their borrowing costs go up. That's not the only effect, of course, of interest rate hikes. It's felt and filtered down into the economy. Now, a big concern for lots of governments around the world is rising inflation due to a range of factors, the latest of which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which will increase the oil price and petrol prices, gas prices, if you want to use the American term, and make it more difficult for people to move around, to conduct business activity. And that cost is also passed into the price of basic goods, so things like bread and maize and milk and all of that stuff that you need every day. So when the Fed especially hikes interest rates, borrowing becomes costlier all around the world. And this is especially true for countries that have dollarized debt, which means countries that have taken advantage of the decade plus of low interest rates by issuing sovereign bonds denominated in dollars. So, for example, in South Africa, if the rand isn't doing as strong, then you buy bonds and you sell your bonds in dollars. With emerging market economies such as South Africa, especially, this now increases the possibility of more pressure going forward as countries emerge from COVID-19 and they want to spend more on things. In South Africa, for example, on infrastructure programs and plans, their spending is more constrained because they're now going to struggle to pay back the interest on their debt. South Africa's debt to GDP ratio, I think at the moment, is projected to hit 71%. It looks like the fiscus is doing okay. But of course, you need to pay back the interest on your debt, never mind the debt itself. So those borrowing costs, as they increase, it constrains government spending even more, and they have to cut back on other services and things. For example, in the South African case, you would hope that maybe they don't give bailouts to things like SAA anymore, but focus on actual service delivery, things like running toilets and fixing roads and that sort of assistance for citizens, for poor citizens who actually need them, instead of bailing out state-owned enterprises. And just the last point on interest rate increases from the Fed, especially, I think emerging market economies, they can't just spend themselves into economic growth. They need to remove the barriers to growth that are in place. So in the South African context, again, things like a high corporate tax that can be lowered, master plans in the form of localization, those aren't going to work. Those will increase inflation and other costs, those should be lowered. That'll then again enable more economic activity and basic things like actually protecting property rights. I know it's quite radical for our ruling party, but that'll encourage more private sector investment, which will again stimulate economic activity and job creation and lower the burden on the state. So those are all examples of what should be done instead of more government spending. And now with interest rates going up, more government spending is going to be more difficult in the first place. So keep an eye on the South African Reserve Bank, what they're going to do. I think they've been relatively good the last few years with their interest rate hikes and what they've tried to do to keep the value of the rand, as it were, in a relatively stable place. But now that the US is increasing interest rates, that'll put a lot of pressure on the South African Reserve Bank.
Definitely. Marius, do you have any comments on this? Any thoughts before we move on?
No, I think the only thing is I'm not sure how much hiking interest rates will be able to tame things like inflation. Might get some way to it, but we've seen there's been a supply chain crisis already coming with COVID, and might get worse depending on what happens in Europe and crisis, or the war rather, in the Ukraine, and sanctions on Russia and so on.
Right. I think I'd agree with that. I think we're headed for a period of sort of general geopolitical instability, and that to me suggests that we probably haven't seen the worst of any of this stuff. Okay, well, we've got about 3.5 minutes left. So let's talk about Mbali Ntuli. Mbali Ntuli was a DA member of the parliamentary legislature in KZN. Her portfolio was cooperative governance and traditional affairs, so basically local government. She announced today that she is resigning from the DA. She says various things. She says that she doesn't believe there's any party in South Africa which is focused on making SA the, quote, equitable and just country it needs to be. She said she's going to be working with community leaders across the country to foster more socio-economic and political change. She, of course, ran for leadership against John Steenhuisen relatively recently, and she was defeated in that contest. She also criticized the DA, saying that she had faced challenges and difficulties inside the party. She criticized its negative internal culture. And she claimed credit for advancing the DA in rural KwaZulu-Natal, in the municipality that she worked in. So I want to say, though, so the big question here is, of course, this was the sort of mainstream media, in this case, Times Live. The headline they had on the story was, "Another top black leader quits the DA," which is quite dramatic. But my sort of feeling here is, apart from fighting with Helen Zille and John Steenhuisen on Twitter, there weren't that many times, I think, that Mbali Ntuli got into the national media until she ran for leader. I may be wrong. Maybe I'm being unfair because she was focused on KZN. Marius, what do you make of Mbali Ntuli and her decision to leave the DA?
She. I think the main thing that come out of this, as you say, is going to be, how the DA is hemorrhaging. It's up and coming black leaders, and they'll point to people like Bongani Baloyi and Phumzile van Dam and so on. While I think Bongani Baloyi is probably quite a great loss, I mean, he had experience in Bidwal and so on. I think some other people, maybe weren't the greatest. But I do think it is a bit of a problem for the DA. It has lost quite a few prominent people recently. I mean, and people have gone to, especially Action SA. Whatever you think about them, they've lost people like John Moody and Abel Tar, I think in Tshwane. Ethel Trollops also joined Action SA. You might not think they're the greatest politicians in the world, but I think it does say something that a lot of people are leaving the DA for Action SA or other things, whatever Mbali Ntuli is going to go off to do. So I think there's definitely something whether it is an issue or not, but the media is definitely going to make it an issue. And I think it's something to keep an eye on. There's a ward by-election coming up in Tshwane in the beginning of May. It's a ward that the DA won in last year in the local government election, won to about 50% of the vote. But I see today Action SA announced their candidate for the award, an older white lady. So it'll be, and I assume Freedom Front Plus will probably also put up a candidate that will do pretty well in Tshwane, especially with places the DA hold awards. So that'll be interesting to watch, and I think that's something to look out for. I think the DA is going to have a lot of fighting to do on both its right and its left flanks. And I don't, whatever Mbali Ntuli's reasons for leaving, doesn't reflect all that well on the DA. Even, whether it would have been Mbali Ntuli would leave on the greatest terms ever, and she's completely happy, and everybody's good friends, and she just wants to go try something different. It's not going to be reflected like that in the media, and probably not in the minds of a lot of voters.
Chris, in 30 seconds or so, your thoughts?
Nothing substantive to add. It'll just be, again, one shouldn't look at these resignations or whatever you want to call them in isolation, but see if there's a trend and see it within a broader sphere of time. So see what has changed in the party or what hasn't, and see if any of their actual governance records reflect what they're trying to do. So I think I would reserve judgment for the time being.
Indeed. Anyway, we will see how the DA deals with this, but I must say I'm somewhat annoyed by the extreme racialization of this thing already, by the kind of race hustlers in the media. But anyway, that's discussion for another time. Thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed the show. We will, of course, have we will be back with you next week for another episode of the Daily Friend Show. Have a most excellent weekend, everyone, and we'll see you then. Cheers.